Welcome to this Asia Global podcast, brought to you by the Asia Global Institute at the University of Hong Kong. I'm your host, Alejandro Reyes, the Institute's Director of Knowledge Dissemination. In our programs here in Hong Kong and online, and in the content that we produce, we focus on presenting Asian perspectives on global issues. This podcast is part of our Meet the Authors series, where we have a conversation with contributors to Asia Global Online and other publications of the Institute. Joining me now from Conway, Arkansas, in the United States, is William M Tsutsui. Bill is the Edwin O. Reischauer Distinguished Professor of Japanese Studies at Harvard University, though he's in Arkansas at the moment, not at Cambridge, Massachusetts, because of the pandemic. And this appointment is for the 2020-21 academic year. From 2014 to 2019, he served as president of Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas, where he is today Professor Emeritus of History. A specialist in the cultural, economic, and environmental history of modern Japan. He is the editor with Michael Baskett of the East Asian Olympiads, 1934 to 2008, Building Bodies and Nations in Japan, Korea, and China. And he's the author of books including Japanese Popular Culture and Globalization and Godzilla on My Mind, 50 Years of the King of Monsters, which I think is Bill's bestseller. Bill, welcome. Thank you for joining.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here.
Yes, well, wonderful. Now, full disclosure, Bill and I go a long way back. I met Bill when I was 14 years old, and I think you were 15 in high school.
We had no gray hair back then.
Right. So we've known each other a long time. So we'll restrain each other. I will restrain myself at least from any inside jokes. So, anyway, Bill, in your article trending on Asia Global Online, you write that since he resigned as Prime Minister for health reasons, Abe Shinzo has generally been praised for his stewardship of Japan for nearly 9 years over 2 terms. While he's the longest serving Japanese leader and he'll rank high among the more memorable and effective of his predecessors, he tended to be more popular abroad than at home. Abe offered an easy-to-grasp economic stimulus and reform program known as Abenomics, but he never managed to hit a real policy home run. Now, you argue that new Prime Minister Suga Yoshihide, you reckon, will stay the course that Abe has plotted, but do so without the same kind of flair that Abe brought to the job. Now, I would note that Japanese prime ministers don't often get well known outside Japan, especially as they don't usually have such long tenures. So now you're a historian. Give us some perspective on some of the other prime ministers that you discuss, that you compare to Abe in terms of longevity. In particular, Yoshida Shigeru, who served 2 terms between 1946 and 1954. And then we'll talk later a bit about Sato Eisaku, who was prime minister from 1964 to 1972. Tell us a bit about Yoshida, and because people remember him for signing the San Francisco Peace Treaty.
Yeah, so Yoshida Shigeru was a lifetime diplomat. He was not a politician by nature. He was born the son of a politician. His mother was actually a geisha, wow. And he was adopted then into a commercial family. He was an Anglophile. He opposed Japan going to war with the United States and Great Britain, During the war, he secretly worked to try and negotiate a peace with the United States, for which he earned himself a short term in prison in Japan. But that then gave him a lot of credibility after the defeat when the American occupiers rode into town. He was installed as foreign minister and subsequently became prime minister and became the third longest serving prime minister in Japan after the war. Yoshida was a nationalist. He really defended the imperial family in Japan, but he was also fundamentally a pragmatist. And he recognized that even though Japan had been defeated militarily, after 1945, it still had a chance of winning the peace if it were canny in exploiting the relationship with the United States. And he pioneered something called the Yoshida Doctrine, which really has guided Japanese foreign policy since that time, although a number of prime ministers, including Abe, have struggled with the Yoshida Doctrine. Yoshida Doctrine was quite simple. Let America carry the bag on Japan's national security, hide under that American nuclear umbrella, minimize Japan's military spending as much as possible to save money, and concentrate wholeheartedly on rebuilding the Japanese economy, on making Japan a commercial powerhouse. This is a huge legacy because in many respects, that is what contributed to the Japanese economic miracle after World War II, this mercantilist mindset where Japan pursued its national interest on the global stage and essentially did so on a free ride when it came to defense from the United States. And of course, he accomplished the return of sovereignty to Japan. He negotiated the San Francisco Peace Treaty, ending the occupation, and perhaps less proudly, he negotiated the Mutual Security Treaty, which allowed American military forces to remain stationed in Japan.
Now, it's interesting because, when you look at photographs of some of these prime ministers, of course, Yoshida-san was a kind of old school because he wore the sort of wing collars and those old style ties, as it were. And as I understand it, he was nicknamed One Man for his independent thinking and his obstinacy, which sounds a little bit like Abe, really, in a way.
There are some continuities there. I think he was more authoritarian than Abe was in many respects, and he cared less about the media in many ways than Abe did. It was a less media-savvy world back then, but he was able to cultivate the one relationship that mattered most, and that was a relationship with Douglas MacArthur. One of the main jobs of all Japanese prime ministers is American taming, and it wasn't so much Washington in those days. It was the Daiichi Insurance Building where MacArthur had his office. And Yoshida learned how to forge a successful relationship with him. One of his strategies was to smile and nod a lot and let
right.
Americans think they were winning, but behind the scenes undermine everything they were trying to do.
I will smile and nod a lot. All right. Now, well, it's interesting you talk about the Yoshida Doctrine because, of course, probably this is the most stress. This doctrine has been under the most stress these days than ever. In large part because of the United States, rather not necessarily because of Japan, but there were the nationalist tendencies of Abe Shinzo, which, of course, he never got to amend the Constitution or change the Constitution. In particular, the sort of Article 9. Anyway, let's talk a bit about Sato Eisaku, because he is really quite well known generally to folks these days, in large part because he, as I believe, is still the only Japanese to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And of course, we're about to learn this year's Nobel Peace Prize winner, I believe, in a few days. And tell us a bit about him, because I remember growing up and actually seeing photographs of a kind of exuberant Sato doing the banzai, and I remember photographs of him with Lyndon Johnson, Nixon, folks like that. And he was quite well known outside of Japan.
Yeah, so Sato Eisaku was an interesting personality in many ways. He really symbolized the ingrown nature of the Japanese political establishment. So his brother was Kishi Nobusuke, who was also a prime minister, also, by the way, a Class A war criminal during World War II. Sato was under Kishi's wing, moved up first through the bureaucracy, then through the political establishment. He had a plum assignment in being the minister in charge of planning the 1964 Olympics, which was sort of Japan's post-war coming out to the world. But when he took over the prime ministership, he had one clear goal, which he articulated, which was the reversion of Okinawa to Japan. So this was a bit of unfinished business from the San Francisco Treaty, that the Americans continued to occupy the Ryukyu Islands. And Sato, flashing a kind of subtle nationalism, wanted to make sure that Japan would get Okinawa back. So he started negotiations in 1965, concluded them with Nixon in 1969, and Okinawa went back to Japan in 1972. Another part of his legacy, and the part that earned him the Nobel Prize, was his work on nuclear issues. So he signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Agreement, and then he articulated the 3 non-nuclear principles, which have really been sort of the guiding strategy of Japanese nuclear policy since that time. Every prime minister has endorsed them since then. It essentially said Japan will not possess nuclear weapons, Japan will not build nuclear weapons, and Japan will not let others introduce nuclear weapons onto their territory. That, of course, was the most troublesome bit of the whole deal, since the Americans still retained military bases, and since they retained military bases on Okinawa as part of the reversion. And of course, many decades later, it was revealed that Sato, in fact, had a secret deal with Nixon that allowed the Americans to bring nuclear weapons onto Okinawa in case of emergency. And so that's one of the reasons his Nobel Prize has been rather controversial over time. He is the only Japanese to win the Nobel Peace Prize for his work on nuclear nonproliferation and keeping Japan nuclear free. And yet many people have criticized that, since actually he was quite a hawk himself, and he personally felt that Japan probably should develop its own nuclear weapons, but bowing to pressure from Washington and pressure from the Japanese people, who really are deeply committed to pacifism, he was pragmatic and got the prize for it in the end.
Interesting. Now, you know that Abe Sato-san is Abe's great uncle, and you also mentioned the relationship with Kishi, and so it's interesting because, of course, Abe's father was also Abe Shintaro was also a leading Japanese politician. He didn't make it to the top, but he was, I believe, foreign minister for
Nakasone's foreign minister, yeah.
And so, you know, this brings out, and as I understand it, Abe Shinzo's brother was raised inside the Kishi family by an uncle, right? So you know, this brings out. I'm wondering if you could talk about this in historical terms, the kind of interconnections and clannishness of Japanese politics, which we often don't appreciate. I mean, if you think about one of the rising stars, Kono Taro, his father was the LDP president, I think the only, or one of the very few, or if not the only LDP president who never became prime minister. And he's one of the leading contenders. So again, there's this clannishness that we don't often understand or appreciate.
Yeah, to complete the inbreeding, of course, Aso Taro is Yoshida Shigeru's grandson as well.
Oh, right. Yes. Yeah, see, that's one that I wasn't even on my radar screen. Yeah.
So, you know, it is interesting, you know, that people abroad really do not have a good sense of the political culture of Japan, which is distinctive, you know. So people in Japan, when they think of their political leadership, one of the first thoughts they have is ingrown, which is definitely right. When you look at these dynastic arrangements within these families, where the powerful are tied in to the wealthy and are often tied into the imperial family in some way as well, making this kind of political, corporate, imperial elite at the top of Japan since World War II and even before World War II in Japan. The other thing Japanese people think about when they think about their political establishment is corruption. That not only is this an ingrown world, but it is also a profoundly corrupt world. Even though we may talk about Sato Eisaku as being the winner of the Nobel Prize, many Japanese tend to think of him as just another corrupt politician, a womanizer, and someone who was accused publicly of spousal abuse. Wow. Japanese people tend to be quite cynical about their political leadership. They tend to be quite unsentimental as well. And so when we think about how few Japanese political leaders have gotten lasting international fame, part of it is because the Japanese people aren't terribly well inclined towards them to begin with. They tend to regard most politicians as self-serving and not exactly high-minded and not primarily dedicated to the goodwill of the people.
Now, this brings me then to another prime minister that you mentioned, Koizumi Junichiro, because of course now he's the father of an up-and-coming LDP member. But in his day, if I'm not mistaken, he was considered as a bit of a roguish outsider, not in the same way as, say, Hosokawa was considered a complete sort of a bit of an outsider, although he was he had sort of a royal line, as I understood Hosokawa. But Koizumi was somewhat different in the sense that he was almost like a rock star. I mean, while Abe Shinzo had his Elvis hairdo, as it were, Koizumi was like a kind of a full bouffant, and he was really quite different, right?
Koizumi knew how to use the media, and that really set him apart from the average Japanese politician. That stereotype of the average Japanese politician, of course, as being gray and characterless, completely lacking in distinction, is pretty much true. And in many ways, Suga Yoshihide fits the bill for the traditional Japanese politician, the backroom dealer, wearing the conservative suit, who does not overwhelm you with charisma or with his public speaking skills. Koizumi was totally different. He was out there, right? His fandom of Elvis, the crazy hairdo, and really some pretty bold moves as prime minister. His great achievement—
Just like Elvis.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, sorry. Yes.
His great achievement as prime minister was privatizing Japan Post, which was the very politically connected and economically inefficient monolith at the center of Japanese life. He decided he could break the power of some of the factions in the LDP and improve the economy by privatizing it. This was not popular amongst especially rural politicians, and they rebelled against him. And so what he did, as you may recall, was he called a snap election, and he did not let those politicians who opposed him run on the LDP ticket. The public loved it because this was totally out of character, and he won a resounding victory. But that was sort of the high point for Koizumi. There's a limit to how much you could accomplish, and I think he pushed it with that.
He was prime minister. I neglected to mention the years 2001 to 2006. And he also had a nickname. He was called Lionheart. Now, one thing that he did do was he visited the Yasukuni Shrine 6 times during his premiership, and that really chilled the relations with Beijing, with China.
Yeah, this is, of course, a hot button issue in Asian politics broadly, and has become sort of one of the major issues that LDP leaders have to deal with. How are they going to deal with the Yasukuni Shrine issue? Of this, of course, being the shrine where the spirits of Japan's war dead, including war criminals, are enshrined in central Tokyo. And Koizumi outdid just about everyone by visiting 6 times in his prime ministership. And as a result, really chilled relationships in Asia, especially with China. What's amazing is Abe, in many ways, has the same image as being a nationalist, and yet Abe was able to walk a finer line with Beijing and not alienate them as some prime ministers, including Koizumi, have.
Now, we shouldn't. We would be remiss if we didn't do a nod to another long-serving Prime Minister, Nakasone Yasuhiro, who might well be the Prime Minister of Japan who's best known in the United States, in large part because he had a kind of friendly relationship with Ronald Reagan. It was like Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan. It was Yasu and Ron, right? It was Maggie and Ron and Yasu and Ron. Nakasone was prime minister from 82 to 87. Tell us a little bit about him, and then we'll move on to other things.
Yeah. Nakasone really was the prototype for both Koizumi and Abe to a large extent. A lot of the policies you see them taking up, he really was the first prime minister to sort of plant the flag on economic liberalization. So bringing more market forces in, structural reform of the Japanese economy, but then also restoring Japan as what he termed a normal nation, which essentially meant a nation that was no longer shackled by Article 9 of the Constitution, and which could have a more independent and militarily powerful role in global affairs. One of the interesting things about Nakasone is he's remembered quite well. He's sort of thought of as the Reagan of Japan in many ways, because his policies paralleled Reagan's fairly closely, but he too did not leave a signature accomplishment for his term. He did privatize Japan Rail, but that was not as near and dear to the hearts of politicians as Japan Post was. And so, again, like Abe, there was a lot of sound and fury, a lot of international attention to what he did, but he ended up not having that profound impact on the way things were done that he might have.
Now, do former prime ministers, once they move into retirement, do they still have any influence? I mean, do they generally still head a faction within the LDP, or how does it generally work? So someone like Nakasone, who's still quite active, as I understand it, does he have any influence in Japanese politics?
So Koizumi has, been quite active since 3/11. He has really stepped up, voicing an anti-nuclear Japan in terms of nuclear energy, that he wants Japan to pull back from nuclear energy. And that has been quite unusual because former prime ministers have generally not been in the limelight. They tend to work in the back rooms of politics. So he is a exception to that. The other one, of course, that has done remarkable, the other one who's been more successful as an ex-prime minister than a prime minister is Aso. 8 years as finance minister and deputy prime minister, and by many accounts has done a creditable job in those roles, certainly served Abe Shinzo very, very well in Tokyo, much more effective than he was in his short and undistinguished term as prime minister.
Perhaps he's been effective as a minister because he had that stint as prime minister. That would be interesting. Now, Bill, let's talk a bit about your background. You're by birth a New Yorker, as I understand it, but I've known you really as a Texan, and I mean, you and Texas, in my mind, are synonymous. So tell us a bit about that, because your father was Japanese. In fact, you and I visited his hometown in Gifu Prefecture in 1985. And your mother is some Scottish American, as I understood it, and they were both academics, and you were born in New York, but then you grew up really in Texas, in Bryan College Station, which is the home of Texas A&M, and you can't get more Texan, in my mind, than being right there in the midst of Texas A&M, you know, which is a great institution, educational institution, but it is really Texas.
Well, I'm hiding my drawl today. I'm sorry, Al, but you know, what you say is right. One of the things I found out today as I was just looking up some stats on Nakasone was he was born the same year as my father, 1918. They both served in the Navy, Japanese Imperial Navy during World War II. What's funny, of course, is that Nakasone came out as a dedicated nationalist, wanted to build up Japanese patriotism. My father came out a decided pacifist and internationalist, and he thought he could fix the world through science. And he came to the United States to pursue that. You know, so he met my mother, who was a biochemist, as postdocs in New York City in the 1950s. When they were married, it was so odd for a Japanese man to marry a white woman that they were written up as a human interest piece in the New York Times.
Right.
And when I was 6, we moved down to Texas. We were one of 2 Japanese American families that lived in Bryan College Station, Texas in the early 1970s. You know, nobody there at the time knew what a Japanese was. In the imaginary of Bryan, Texas, you were either black, white, or Mexican. So when my father walked down the street, people would speak to him in Spanish. He thought it was hilarious and would respond in Japanese, made a lot of friends that way. But it was an interesting upbringing for me because I had very little to relate to when it came to Japan.
And then, of course, you went to the logical step was to go to high school in the liberal Northeast. So in Massachusetts.
You know, I'll tell you how that happened. My father was on an airplane going back to Houston, and he sat next to a high school counselor from one of the suburban high schools in New York City in Westchester County, one of those really competitive high schools. And my father is very, you know, sort of, you know, a tiger mother kind of thing. He asked the counselor, what can I do to get my son into Harvard? And the response was, send him to boarding school in Massachusetts. So my father came back from the airport and said, you're going to boarding school?
Well, if that didn't happen, we wouldn't have met. So there we go. So now, so tell us a bit about how you got into becoming a historian, because now you did get into Harvard, and you were in East Asian Studies, as I recall, your concentration, your major. And then you went on to Oxford, where you did a master's degree in history, focusing on Japan. And as far as I can remember, your research work really started with Japanese economic history and the Dodge line, right? It was a big issue for you, and which was instrumental in sort of the economic recovery of Japan. Tell us a bit about how you got interested in that kind of Japanese economic political history. And in fact, what is the Dodge line? Because it's something that people don't know about, but was very important, not only in your career, your research career, but also in terms of economic policy.
Yeah, so, you know, I went to college thinking I was going to be an economics major, imagining myself going into business, working in a skyscraper, you know, fancy suits, fast cars, all of that. And then I took a freshman class from Ezra Vogel, who of course is a well-known sociologist of Japan and China, still active in the field, retired now.
He's active here at the Institute, yes.
He is amazing. I just spoke with him recently on the phone, you know, and that course really changed my life. That I said, boy, you know, I can take this love of the economy and apply it to the study of Japan and Asia and really do some neat and important things with it. And Ezra was head of the East Asian Studies program then, so I went to talk with him. He signed me up as a major. I didn't major in econ, and I never looked back in some way. That really set my course. My undergraduate thesis, as you said, was on the Dodge line. So Japan after World War II experienced hyperinflation. There were a lot of people who needed a lot of things, and there just wasn't much around. So prices went through the roof. The government was printing money. Joseph Dodge was a Detroit banker who was brought over by MacArthur, and his job was to bring financial rigor, essentially, to the Japanese state. He slashed the budget. There were a lot of job losses. The economy looked like it was headed down, but it was just exactly the medicine that the Japanese needed at that point to steady the ship financially and set the course for the economic miracle ahead. It's one of those untold stories of Japanese history that ended up being tremendously important.
Indeed, I find that there are many of these sort of untold stories about Japanese economy and trying to fully understand how the combination of you connected the Yoshida Doctrine to the economic development of Japan, because by doing the security on the cheap, if you will, by having the United States guarantee security, it did free up a lot of resources for Japan to become the economic miracle, if you will, and that then led them to the Olympics in '64. And such. So I mean, it's an interesting, the political economy, the interaction of economic policy and the politics and the geopolitics is very interesting. Now, you went to Oxford to do a master's degree, and you also focused on Japanese history there. And then, as I remember it, it's not too long ago, you went off to Yale Law School for a little bit, I think 2 weeks, I think. And
6 weeks. I made 6 weeks.
Okay, 6 weeks, a little bit longer than I remember. And then, you realized that calling and you went to do a PhD in history at Princeton. Tell us a bit about that sort of transformation, because I remember, it was an important part of your life. Not only you met Marjorie, your wife, but at Oxford, but that switch to finally really commit to becoming a historian. It's a very interesting change of mindset.
I really appreciated the change of location, going to Britain and being in a different educational
You were a Marshall
system.
Scholar, as I recall. Yeah.
Was really fortunate to have 2 years at Oxford in the mid-1980s, where I did a degree that was only a thesis. I didn't have to take any coursework. Nobody knew where I was going to be. I could spend all the time in the library if I wanted to. It gave me a lot of freedom. And I thought at the time that this would allow me to sort of get this research bug out of my system. I would do all the research left about the Japanese economy I wanted to do, and then I could go get a real job. Because I never thought my parents had real jobs, Working as an academic is like heaven, And so I thought, I needed to really bear down. But I just loved it, And the work I did at Oxford on history of banking in Japan after World War II ended up being published, amazingly enough to me. And I realized when I was in law school that, my gosh, those law textbooks were just miserable. And all the people around me were not having any fun doing law. Right. And that I wanted to be in a place where the ideas interested me and people were passionate about what they did. And I found that in graduate school and the academy. Never looked back.
Now, interesting that, of course, your initial focus was on Japanese economic history, and you've talked till now a lot about some of the factors that went into Japanese economic development to where it is today. But you've since broadened to talk a bit more about Japanese popular culture, Japanese influence in sort of cultural globalization, if you will. Your book on the Olympiads that you co-edited or worked with that really focused on, in some ways, I guess it was as a preview to the 2020 Olympics, which has been postponed till next year. So, but while this came after your interest in economic policy, actually your devotion to Japanese popular culture came much earlier, when you were a kid, when you were 9. And you know, I note for our viewers, for viewers, that you have the Godzilla poster behind you. You really became a Godzilla fan when you were 9, as I recall. Tell us now a bit about this sort of fascination and how it has now become part of your academic life and part of your educational experience, because you are teaching a course now related that we can talk about. Yeah.
So, you know, I really grew up with Godzilla. You know, I remember watching my first Godzilla movie lying on the shag carpeting in my parents' bedroom one Saturday afternoon. The Creature double feature was on TV, and there was a Godzilla movie. Big monster walking through Tokyo, making it explode. You know, I fell in love at that moment. I wanted to be Godzilla, right? I was a kid, you know, here's this big, huge, powerful monster. But what made it special for me, I think, was it was a Japanese monster. And for me, this was something positive about Japan that I could identify with. My friends thought it was cool. So rather than being teased about Pearl Harbor, having Godzilla as something that could draw us together was important to me. And so, you know, Godzilla was not just something that I responded to sort of on a entertainment level, but something I responded to on an identity level as well. When I started teaching at college, I thought, boy, you know, I wonder if I could use a Godzilla movie in my classes, because they really show well the themes in Japanese history since World War II. The series started in 1954. It continues today. Really, it is a panorama of Japan, the changes in Japan over these decades. So I started using the Godzilla films, and the students loved them. And one of the things that I found most wonderful was there is no one who starts watching a giant monster movie thinking they're going to learn something important about history. And yet you can sucker punch them into just that. And so I found it very effective in the classroom and started doing research on it. You know, after the bubble economy burst in Japan, a lot of that interest in Japanese business and economics evaporated. And I'll be honest, I lost some of my interest as well, but Godzilla was still there for me and has been very good to me.
I guess we should be happy that you didn't become a fan of Tora-san or something. Or else you'd be doing many different things now.
I could have made another franchise popular in that case.
Or Hello Kitty, I don't know. But now, in fact, you know, Godzilla has a personality, right? I mean, this is something that you wrote this book, Godzilla in My Mind, and I think in many ways, it's you're going into that personality and trying to understand that personality in many of its incarnations. Of course, Godzilla new movies keep on popping up. Just tell us a little bit about that. You know, what Godzilla represents in terms of that identity, what it says about Japanese culture, what the monster says about Japanese culture.
You know, to me, the beauty of Godzilla is that Godzilla is not just a lizard. Godzilla is not just a surviving dinosaur. Godzilla is not just an irradiated creature that wants to do nothing but destroy. The genius of those movies was that they gave Godzilla a character and, you know, I would even go so far as to say a soul in those movies. You go back and watch that original 1954 film, and a lot of people want to reduce it to a single metaphor. Godzilla equals the bomb, Godzilla equals death. It's so much more subtle than that, and it really captures the pain that the Japanese were going through after the atomic bombings, after World War II. amidst the Cold War, when Japan was very much caught between the United States and Russia. And the monster taps into that in really remarkable ways. You know, one of the things I love about the movies is, you know, people laugh when they see that Godzilla is a man in a rubber suit, right? But that to me is part of humanizing the monster. On some level, when you look at that creature walking through Tokyo, you know there's a person inside there. That registers, that means something, that gives you an empathy for the monster. And it also underlines how that monster is more than just a being. That monster is a really fully formed, sentient force, almost human, really. If you look at the American Godzilla movies that have been made, and of course there's been one made in the 90s, there have been a couple made recently by Legendary Pictures, one coming out next year, Godzilla versus Kong. American filmmakers are hung up on Godzilla being an animal and being driven by genetic programming. They don't really want to acknowledge that Godzilla can be a hero, that Godzilla can be a conscience for the world, that Godzilla can be an actor in his own right on the stage. And that's what I think makes the series so special over the decades.
Do you think then that Godzilla as a computer-generated image in the age of CGI, that Godzilla still works in the same way that it did when it was, I mean, I hate to use the word cheesy, but a little bit more camp, if you will.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. I miss the guy in the rubber suit. I'm going to be honest with you, you know, and I think a lot of purists still do, that there was something special about that. And of course, it did become a filmmaking technology that the Japanese were uniquely successful at. What Toho, the studio that made the Godzilla movies, called suitmation, was this process of building very elaborate miniatures, then, you know, dressing people up as monsters and having them walk through them. You know, some of these Japanese special effects technicians were sort of the Michelangelos of suitmation. They really did phenomenal work. And if you go into it with that mindset, you know, it's fine to laugh at Godzilla movies, but, you know, there is a lot of artistry in there as well. And it gives a completely different final product than just a computer image does.
Interesting. Now, let's get back to your career in education, because whilst you were teaching in Kansas, at Kansas University, you then sort of shifted into doing some administrative, some dean work, as it were, becoming a dean, and then you became the dean of the Dedman School, I believe, humanities and arts and sciences at Southern Methodist University, SMU, in Dallas. And then from there, you became president of Hendrix College in Conway, Arkansas. Tell us a bit about that shift from being a historian, researcher, to becoming an administrator, and then, you know, taking over a college, a small liberal arts university that's very focused on the state in which it is. But it's a different kind of job, and in many ways, it combines both the academic and the business career that you had thought you might want to have.
Yeah, you know, I think that's one of the appealing things about it. One of the things I like about the academic life is, you know, there's no routine in academic life. I think a lot of people feel that, you know, because their school years and everything just repeats itself, that it's always the same, but it really is not. There are tremendous opportunities to take on new challenges, to learn new things. And from the start, I was just really interested in expanding myself. And administration is tough. Academic administration in particular is very difficult. And yet I cared so much about what we did, and I had so much idealism about higher education. I wanted to make it better. And I started, you know, very traditionally, became department chair, center director, associate dean, then moved up the hierarchy. Didn't really think about it at any step along the way, just sort of got carried away on this magic carpet, but enjoyed every step of it. learned a lot, and I think did some good things as well. One of the best things about academic administration is working with other smart people on tough issues. College campuses are filled with bright folks who are passionate about what they do, passionate about education, and having the opportunity to bring them together and work with them on really vexed issues, that's something special. And if it works and you come to a good conclusion, that's even better.
But of course, the big challenge is that you're not only dealing with academic issues, and all that that entails, but you're dealing with social issues, as it were, how the students live amongst each other, and then you're dealing with budgets, so the hard numbers, and then you're also having to be, in some ways, the chief fundraiser. Yep. For the institution. So it's really many different roles. And I'm wondering, if you could just say something about the challenges to higher education, particularly in the context we have now, this pandemic, because my reckoning is that the pandemic is simply intensifying the challenges that higher education already had been facing, in terms of budgets, students, reliance on international students, and all of those questions, but also the academic issues in maintaining quality and integrity in education. And then you mentioned, things like diversity, which have become so important these days.
I think you're exactly right, Al. The pandemic has just exacerbated, some pre-existing issues, made them much more pressing and obvious. Yeah. And so, the first one is that the fundamental business model of American higher education is broken right now. We have a very high cost structure in this country. Universities are very expensive to run as they currently stand with all the services they provide. Meanwhile, state and federal support of higher education has been declining for decades. And even though donors have been extraordinarily generous to private colleges, they've not been able to keep pace with the increasing costs either. And so the way the colleges and universities have responded is by first trying to recruit more students, and international students was a huge part of that, and then trying to get everyone to pay more to go to college. And we see how the costs of higher education have just gone through the roof in the United States. Those aren't sustainable any longer. The demographics are not supporting increased enrollments across the board. America's about to go off a demographic cliff in the next few years with declining numbers of high school graduates and unlikely to capture the kind of international student populations it had in the past. Meanwhile, with the hollowing out of the middle class, in this country, there aren't people who can afford to pay the big prices, and people don't want to take on the debt necessary to go to American colleges anymore. So this has to be fixed. As you say, the other one is a big issue that I think has really been brought to the fore by the pandemic and the issues last summer in the United States are social and racial justice issues, which have been simmering on college campuses for a long time, but which, of course, are so much more difficult in the kind of polarized political environment like we have now in the United States. And is going to be very, very difficult to deal with those, especially after this election, and especially after the sort of the trauma that we as a nation have faced in this pandemic and everything associated with it when ultimately we come back to our campuses.
Now, you are very familiar, of course, with the Japanese higher education system. And I know you visited China quite a bit. And when you were at Hendrix, you had I think Hendrix has a tie-in with the university in Zhuhai. What were your thoughts seeing higher education in Japan, higher education in China in terms of where they're coming from in terms of their emerging as higher education powerhouses, if you will, versus what's happening in the United States in terms of, we still consider the United States to be at the pinnacle of higher education, particularly in research and science and technology, STEM areas. But what is the global picture from your perspective?
Yeah, you know, I think America's position at that pinnacle is a very insecure one right now. You know, I think the genius of the American higher education system has come from a combination of factors, one of which is the freedom of our society that really encourages that freedom to conduct research on university campuses. Another, though, has been public and private support for higher education. And that, as I mentioned, has been drying up in recent decades. Meanwhile, you know, you see the investment that's being made in higher education in other parts of the world, notably in China, and you say that, you know, there is the potential for some really remarkable transformation down the road, but can you accomplish that in an environment without that intellectual freedom, without that sort of commitment to that academic breadth and fearlessness that is necessary for transformation? You know, if you look at America's great success story, I think it's Silicon Valley, the relationship with Stanford, the kind of energy and new culture that developed in that particular place at that particular time. You can't plan something like that. It just happens. I worry one day we're going to wake up and that's happened somewhere in China, and all of a sudden America finds itself really struggling to catch up.
Well, what about Japan's higher education system? How do you see that? Because we know a lot about you know, the top universities, but we don't really know in terms of the bigger picture for Japan.
Yeah, Japanese education system, like the American education system, is quite diverse. So there are some really wonderful global universities in Japan, but there are also a large number of, you know, as is familiar in the United States as well, quite mediocre institutions, including some very large mediocre institutions. What I think is striking about the Japanese academic scene is how much progress Japanese universities have made in recent decades in terms of internationalizing. You know, for a long time, it was lip service in Japan that they would become more international institutions. It is now happening delivery of education in English is becoming much more common. Japanese scholars are much more plugged in globally, and the level of Japanese scientific research has increasingly moved from corporations and from the private sector into public sector institutions. And I think this bodes well for the future.
Yeah, no, I presented a paper on China and Japan in 1995, and then more recent visits have, I mean, the change has been significant. I mean, back in those days, I mean, the number of academics or colleagues who could communicate in English was really quite limited. Yeah. And I think the same is happening in China. I think that there's significant shifts in that regard. Now, Bill, your next adventure, or you're already into your next adventure in academia, is the Edwin O. Reischauer Distinguished Professor of Japanese Studies at Harvard University, which of course your old stomping grounds and
our old stomping grounds.
Yes, thank you very much. But you're not actually there because of the pandemic. And now tell us a bit about that, because it's really quite a feather in your cap. I think this is really, in many ways, for Japanese studies, this is a very distinguished position.
Well, I'm truly been blessed through my career with some wonderful opportunities, and the timing on this couldn't have been better to retire from the presidency and be able to spend a year at Harvard to see how truly the 1% of the academic world lives. It is amazingly just the riches of resources that Harvard has in terms of the faculty, in terms of the students, in terms of the library, in terms of the staff support. Even in a moment like this, where we can't go to campus itself, is phenomenal. And so it has just been inspiring for me. You know, this semester I'm teaching graduate students, and I compare the graduate students now to how I was 30 years ago. They know so much more they are able to use technology so much more seamlessly. There is so much available online. Their linguistic skills are more advanced. It is really impressive and frankly reassuring about the future of the world. Every time I start feeling dark about what's going to happen, I look at the students I have the opportunity to work with and say, you know, as long as there are folks like this, as bright as this and as idealistic as this, change is possible.
And what of the pandemic in terms of how you've been coping and how this has affected, you've already alluded to it, the work that you're doing? How have you and Marjorie, your wife, and your dog, your Shiba, right? Kiba, or Kiba.
Kiba, that's right,
yes.
Yeah.
How are you all doing, and safe and sound in Arkansas? And are you going to go to Cambridge or in Massachusetts, or how have you guys been doing?
I hope to go to Cambridge in the spring. Until that point, I've been thankful for the technology that we have now, even as I'm sort of frustrated by the technology we have now. What strikes me is I think we've come to a kind of new normal. At this point, it snuck up on us. For a long time, we were waiting for something dramatic to happen. And now, all of a sudden, we live in a world of this kind of communication. And I see the value in it, and I see the limitation in it. And it's just going to be interesting to see how, as a society here in America and how, as a globe, we adjust to everything we have been through over these 8 months, and the clock's still running on that. How do we come back together? How do we engage as a community again? How do we enrich person-to-person relationships with technology? And when can we get to work at some of the really serious problems we have that I feel have been on hold because we have the excuse of the pandemic?
Now, you've been generous with your time, Bill, but I want to just end by going back to Japan, because you're very active with the U.S.-Japan Council, with the Japan-U.S. Friendship Commission. You speak a lot about not only Godzilla, but Japanese culture and Japanese issues. You wrote your excellent article for us. Tell us a bit about, in some ways, you know, getting more and more involved in your Japanese identity, if you will. How do you see that? Because it's a very, you know, it's something that I think many people of two different worlds, cultural worlds, at different times in their lives, they like to recapture, if you will, part of themselves that maybe they weren't able to reflect on in their careers. But you have a different sort of opportunity now in terms of U.S.-Japan relations and just being engaged more deeply in Japanese culture and Japanese issues.
You know, Japanese Americans are an interesting ethnic group in the United States because of that unique experience of internment during World War II.
Especially in Arkansas, right? I mean,
yes,
Arkansas
two of the camps were here in Arkansas.
Yeah.
You know, because of that experience, Japanese Americans have tended not to be such a cohesive community over time. That after being identified, separated out, and then imprisoned during the war, in some ways, Japanese Americans don't want to associate with each other, don't want to be in Japantowns or whatever, little Tokyos around the country. Consequently, Japanese Americans, more than any other ethnic group, tend to marry outside their ethnic group. So there's a lot of intermarriage, and that sense of Japanese Americanness is becoming diluted over time. You know, I found that as we all have become more interested in identity, I've become more interested in relating to that and finding ways to channel that Japanese American identity into my longstanding interest in the US-Japan relationship, which I think is one of the critical bilateral relationships on the globe. I realize that, you know, many on both sides of the Pacific wonder if it's as strong or ever will be as strong as it once was, but I believe it's going to be more critical going forward. And I want to spend all the energy I have, especially at this point in my life, to try and build those ties, build those bridges, and ensure that the U.S. and Japan can be strong partners going forward to solve what are some really profound issues facing the world right now.
Now, your father, he was not a man of many words. I mean, I knew him, but I mean, I think that's fair to say, right? Yeah. But what do you think he would think about your career now that was very involved with his native country and his culture, that's really what you made your professional career? I mean, what do you think he might say?
You know, I think my father's dream, my father died quite young, but I think his dream was always to go back to Japan when he retired and reconnect with his homeland in that way. And I'd like to think that he would be happy that I've continued some of his dream of contributing to international peace and understanding through my work. Of course, being a Japanese father, he would never be satisfied with what I did and always have wanted me to do more. Why aren't you Prime Minister, Bill? See,
I'm going to nod and I'm going to smile.
That's it, exactly. Smile and nod.
Yes. Well, Bill, thank you very much. It's been wonderful to have you as our guest. I commend our viewers and listeners to Bill's article on AsiaGlobal Online. Please subscribe to AsiaGlobal Online or the AsiaGlobal Institute's website. Go and subscribe so you can receive our information. And please follow us on social media, Facebook, LinkedIn, Twitter, and you know the drill. So I can't keep track anymore. But Bill, it's really a pleasure to see you. And I hope you and Marjorie and Kiba, you stay safe and enjoy yourselves in your sort of isolation. I guess things are a little bit less isolated now, but keep safe.
Thank you so much, Al. This was a real joy.
Thanks.